Hello Year 12s and welcome to this video on the 2023 referendum about an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. There are three things that you need to do while you're watching this video. The first thing is to take the very best Cornell notes that you can. The second thing is to use the pause and rewind functions. Use the pause function if you need to stop this video to take notes. Use the rewind function if you need to go over any information contained in this video. And the third thing that you need to do is have your summary books open in front of you. As we go through this video, I will give you some guidance as to what you should include in your summary books. Once you've finished watching this video, please make sure that you read the sections from the textbook referred to on this slide. And if you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, then supplement your Cornell notes with that additional information. Well, let's get started then. On this slide, I've set out the learning intentions for this video. Make sure that you write these learning intentions down in your Cornell notes. As a result of watching and taking notes on this video, you should be able to do two things. First, you should be able to explain the significance of the 2023 referendum about an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Second, you should be able to discuss the ability of the Australian people to change the Australian Constitution, including in relation to past and future constitutional reform. We will be using the 2023 referendum about an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to support points you could make in this discussion. We will also be using the successful 1967 referendum, which is the subject of another video, to support points you could make in this discussion. So this video about the 2023 voice referendum and the other video about the 1967 referendum complement each other. The 2023 voice referendum is an example of an unsuccessful referendum because the changes to the Constitution that were proposed in that referendum were not approved by the Australian people in accordance with the double majority requirement. In fact, voting at that referendum did not satisfy either limb of the double majority requirement. First, the referendum proposal was not approved by the majority of all voters in Australia. Only 39.94% of voters in Australia voted in favour of the referendum proposal, which means that 60.06% of voters in Australia voted against the referendum proposal. Second, the referendum proposal was not approved by a majority of voters in the majority of states. In fact, there was not a majority of voters in any state that voted in favour of the referendum proposal. The no votes varied from 54.15% in Victoria to 68.21% in Queensland. Only the majority of voters in the Australian Capital Territory, 61.29%, voted in favour of the referendum proposal, but the Australian Capital Territory is a territory and not a state, and so the votes in the Australian Capital Territory are not counted at all for the purposes of the second limb. Put another way, the 2023 voice referendum is an example of how the Australian people can refuse to change the Australian Constitution. In particular, the 2023 voice referendum illustrates some of the factors that can cause a referendum to be unsuccessful. Before we look at the actual referendum and the factors that caused it to be unsuccessful, let me give you a bit of background. This is really just for context, and you don't need to learn it. In 2015, the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and the then opposition leader Bill Shorten established a referendum council to discuss options for changing the Constitution so as to recognise Australia's Indigenous people. In 2017, this Referendum Council held a National First Nations Constitutional Convention at Uluru. This convention issued the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which called for three things. First, the Uluru Statement from the Heart called for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. This voice was envisaged to be a representative body consisting of Australia's First Nations people that would provide advice to the Commonwealth Parliament and Commonwealth Government on laws and policies that affected Australia's First Nations people. Second, the Uluru Statement from the Heart called for a treaty or treaties between the Commonwealth and state governments and Australia's First Nations people to acknowledge and give legal effect to the cultural rights and interests of Australia's First Nations people. And third, the Uluru Statement from the Heart called for a process of truth-telling that would delve into Australia's historical treatment of its First Nations people and the impact of that treatment. The Referendum Council endorsed this approach, but the then Liberal National Party coalition government rejected it. Instead, the government commissioned work on the structure of a voice that could be included in Commonwealth legislation rather than in the Constitution. The culmination of this work was a 2021 report by Professors Tom Calma and Marcia Langdon that proposed a voice consisting of 24 First Nations representatives appointed by local and regional voice bodies that would advise the Commonwealth Parliament and the Commonwealth Government on matters relating to the social, spiritual and economic well-being of Australia's First Nations people. The voice would be an advisory body and could not veto legislation. However, in 2022 at the Garma Festival in East Arnhem Land, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced that the newly elected Labor government supported enshrining the voice in the Constitution. This led to the triggering of the Section 128 procedure for amending the Constitution that we've already looked at. The first stage in amending the Constitution to include the voice was for the Commonwealth Parliament to pass a bill to amend the Constitution so as to include the voice. This bill needed to be passed by an absolute majority of both the House of Representatives and the Senate. An absolute majority means that the bill needed to be passed by a number of votes in the House of Representatives that is more than half of the seats in the House of Representatives, that is, by 76 or more votes, and by a number of votes in the Senate that is more than half of the seats in the Senate, that is, by more than 38 votes. The bill to amend the Constitution to include the voice was called the Constitution Alteration Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice Bill 2023. This bill proposed to amend the Constitution to include a new Section 129. This section was entitled Recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples, and it read as follows. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. 1. There shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. 2. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. 3. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. This change responded to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which called for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. There were three key parts to this proposed amendment to the Constitution. First, the proposed new Section 129 recognised Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as Australia's first peoples. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the first inhabitants of Australia, having occupied the Australian continent for over 60,000 years. Second, the proposed new Section 129 provided for the establishment of a body called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. The Voice was intended to be an independent advisory body that would make representations to the Commonwealth Parliament and the Commonwealth Government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, for example, on laws and policies that affected the rights and interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The intention was that the members of the Voice would be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples based on the wishes of local communities. The Voice was not to be able to prevent, delay or veto legislation passed by the Commonwealth Parliament or policies adopted by the Commonwealth Government, but could only make suggestions, that is, provide advice. Third, the proposed new Section 129 contemplated that the Commonwealth Parliament would pass legislation that set out the composition, functions, powers and procedures of the Voice. This legislation was only to be made if the referendum was successful. Once made, this legislation could subsequently be amended by the Commonwealth Parliament like any other Commonwealth legislation. However, because the Voice would have been established by the Constitution, the Voice itself could only be abolished if the Constitution was amended in the future to remove the Voice. This would require another referendum. The bill amending the Constitution was passed by the House of Representatives on the 31st of May 2023, with 121 votes in favour of the bill and 25 votes against the bill. This was an absolute majority of the House of Representatives because it is at least 76 votes. That is, it is more than half of the seats in the House of Representatives. While the Liberal National Party coalition's policy was to oppose the change to the Constitution, their policy was to allow a referendum on the change to go ahead so that the Australian people could decide whether the Constitution should be changed to include the Voice. The Senate subsequently passed the bill on the 19th of June 2023, with 52 votes in favour of the bill and 19 votes against the bill. Again, this was an absolute majority of the Senate because it is more than 38 votes. That is, it is more than half of the seats in the Senate. This leads us to the second stage in amending the Constitution to include the Voice, which is for that amendment to be approved at a referendum. A referendum is a compulsory vote by the Australian people on a proposed change to the wording of the Constitution. The referendum on the Voice was held on the 14th of October 2023. Before the referendum, the Australian Electoral Commission sent out to every household in Australia a yes-no case pamphlet that set out the arguments both for and against the Voice. At a referendum to amend the Constitution, the Australian people do not vote on the actual bill. Instead, they vote either yes or no to a question that summarises the amendment to the Constitution. In the case of the Voice referendum, voters were required to vote yes or no to the following question: a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? A referendum will only be successful, that is, the Constitution will only be amended if the double majority requirement is satisfied. This means that the two limbs of the double majority requirement must be satisfied. The first limb is that the majority of all voters in Australia, that is, including voters in the territories, must approve the referendum proposal. And the second limb is that a majority of voters in the majority of states, that is, in at least 4 out of the 6 states, must approve the referendum proposal. As we've seen, the Voice referendum failed both of these limbs. The majority of Australian voters voted no, and the majority of voters in all 6 states voted no. So the 2023 Voice referendum is an example of how the Australian people can refuse to change the Constitution. In the 2023 Voice referendum, the Australian people refused to change the Constitution so as to include in it an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. The 2023 Voice referendum is significant because it illustrates some of the factors that can cause a referendum to be unsuccessful. There have been 45 referendums to change the Constitution since Federation in 1901, but only 8 of those referendums have been successful. The 2023 Voice referendum is one of the 37 unsuccessful referendums, so it is instructive to consider the factors that contributed to the failure of this referendum. These factors are set out in the table on this slide and the next 2 slides. Make sure that you include a copy of this table in your summary books. There were 5 key factors that contributed to the failure of the 2023 Voice referendum. The first factor that contributed to the failure of the 2023 Voice referendum was that there was not bipartisan support for the referendum proposal. Bipartisan support means that both the government and the opposition support the referendum proposal. No referendum has been successful where it does not have bipartisan support. This is because where the opposition opposes the referendum proposal, it is much less likely that the double majority requirement will be satisfied, because opposition party voters are likely to vote as the opposition suggests, that is, against the referendum proposal. The Voice referendum did not have bipartisan support because, although the Labor government supported it, the Liberal National Party coalition opposed it. The second factor that contributed to the failure of the 2023 Voice referendum was that there was significant community opposition to the referendum proposal. A referendum proposal is less likely to be approved if there is significant community opposition to it, because the double majority requirement is only satisfied if the referendum proposal is voted for by both the majority of voters in Australia and the majority of voters in a majority of states, that is, in at least 4 out of the 6 states. There was significant opposition to the Voice referendum amongst different sections of the community. Some Indigenous people, including Australians for Unity, opposed the Voice because they believed it would do nothing to improve the lives of Australia's First Nations people, but would instead be a bureaucratic body that did not truly represent local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, particularly regional and remote Indigenous communities. Other Indigenous people, including the Treaty Before Voice movement, opposed the Voice because they believed that there should instead be a treaty with Australia's First Nations people that granted them sovereignty and real power over themselves, rather than a voice that just enabled Australia's First Nations people to give advice to Parliament and government about laws and policies that affected Indigenous people. And some people opposed the Voice because they regarded the Voice as giving Australia's First Nations people special access to Parliament and government that other groups did not have. They viewed the Voice as dividing the country on the basis of race. The third factor that contributed to the failure of the 2023 Voice referendum was voter conservatism. Voter conservatism refers to the fact that voters tend to be conservative and so against changing the Constitution unless a very compelling case for change is made. Voter conservatism can prevent a referendum from succeeding because the double majority requirement will only be satisfied if the referendum proposal is voted for by both the majority of voters in Australia and the majority of voters in a majority of states, that is, in at least 4 out of the 6 states. Voter conservatism was a factor in the Voice referendum for a number of reasons. Some voters were concerned that the Voice would have too much power and would be able to influence a wide range of government decisions, including national security and economic decisions. Some voters were concerned that the power of the Voice to make suggestions about government policies would delay government decision-making. Some voters were concerned that there could be lots of legal challenges to government decisions if the government did not properly take into account suggestions made by the Voice to the government. Some voters did not think that the Voice would make any practical difference to the disadvantages suffered by Australia's First Nations people. Some voters were concerned that the Voice would be the first step in Australia's First Nations people claiming sovereignty over parts of Australia or claiming compensation for past events, such as the settlement of Australia by the British, the removal of Indigenous children from their parents as part of the stolen generation, and the current disadvantages suffered by Australia's First Nations people. The fourth factor that contributed to the failure of the 2023 Voice referendum was voter confusion. Voter confusion refers to the fact that voters are more likely to vote against a referendum proposal if they do not understand it. Voter confusion can prevent a referendum from succeeding because the double majority requirement will only be satisfied if the referendum proposal is voted for by both the majority of voters in Australia and the majority of voters in a majority of states, that is, in at least 4 out of the 6 states. Voter confusion was a factor in the failure of the Voice referendum to satisfy the double majority requirement for a number of reasons. First, the fact that there was significant opposition to the Voice referendum from Indigenous people resulted in non-Indigenous voters being confused about whether Indigenous people actually wanted the Voice, and as a result, those voters voted against the Voice. Second, the government didn't provide much detail on how the Voice was intended to operate. It was intended that this detail would be included in Commonwealth legislation that would only be made if the referendum was successful. However, the fact that voters did not have information about matters such as how members of the Voice were to be chosen meant that voters were confused about the way the Voice would actually operate and so voted against the Voice. And third, there was a lot of conflicting and sometimes misleading information about the advantages and disadvantages of the Voice. This would have confused many voters who therefore decided to vote against the Voice. Where voters do not understand the referendum proposal, voters are more likely to vote against it. This means that it is important that there is a strong information and education campaign in the lead up to the referendum that clearly describes the referendum proposal and the reasons for it. This is the fifth factor that contributed to the failure of the 2023 Voice referendum. In the lead up to the Voice referendum, there was no significant and informative public education campaign in support of the Voice, and so many voters remained confused and therefore would have voted against the referendum proposal because they did not understand it. Because the Voice referendum proposal was not approved at the referendum, the Constitution Alteration Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice Bill 2023 could not be given royal assent, and so the Constitution was not amended to include the Voice. Well, this brings us to the end of this video. As a result of watching and taking notes on this video, you should now be able to do 2 things. First, you should be able to explain the significance of the 2023 referendum about an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Second, you should be able to discuss the ability of the Australian people to change the Australian Constitution, including in relation to past and future constitutional reform. Now, don't forget to read the sections from the textbook referred to on the first slide. And if you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, make sure that you supplement your Cornell notes with that additional information. Thank you for your attention.